All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, I wanted to take a look at two competing news items that are out that could portend exactly how things will unfold in the event that Bernie Sanders were able to win the nomination. So first is from BuzzFeed, where reporters interviewed dozens of Democratic primary voters at a Joe Biden event about what exactly they would do if Bernie were to become the nominee. These were mostly older folks who bought into the mainstream fear-mongering about Bernie's electability and mostly listed Biden, Klobuchar, and Warren as their likely top picks. Yet, the verdict came back unanimous. Of course, they would absolutely vote for the Democratic nominee, even if their chosen candidate lost. So 71-year-old Sandy Stanley told reporter Nidhi Prakash that, quote, "I would vote for my dead cat over Trump." Not one voter interviewed, even those with the deepest ambivalence toward Sanders, was anything but absolutely committed to supporting him if he is the nominee. Now, a very different story was unfolding in interviews conducted by the Washington Examiner of Never Trump Republicans. So after years of insisting that Trump was the most dangerous president ever, now that they have a chance to try to help bounce him out of office, they're getting cold feet. A despondent Never-Trumper and former New Hampshire GOP chairwoman told them, "I don't know where the anti-Trump movement goes from there." I guess they only wanted him out through an elite-driven, DC-centric process, not through an actual grassroots populist movement, otherwise known as democracy. Even Joe Biden doesn't sound terribly sure that he would back Bernie, telling reporters, "I'm not going to make judgments now. I just think that it depends upon how we treat one another between now and the time we have a nominee." So let me get this straight. We've got to beat Trump, the most dangerous president in American history, no matter what. Unless that means supporting Bernie Sanders, because Lord knows America can't have a radical like Sanders who actually believes in everyone having health care and a living wage. Of course, those voices should be added to that of professional bitter person Hillary Clinton, who had to be dragged kicking and screaming to a mild commitment to support Sanders if he is the nominee. Bret Stephens over the New York Times recently revealed that while he can't stand Trump, he would never, ever vote for Bernie. This in spite of the fact that he also argues Trump is a demagogue and that he believes Bernie is the most likely to actually defeat Trump. But in the end, he's got to stay true to his class interest. Then there was Bloomberg advisor Stephen Ratner, who had this to say over on MSNBC.
So there's a lot of activity around trying to, quote, stop Bernie, although it isn't called by that just yet. And that's and Mike Bloomberg could well play a role in that.
Mike Bloomberg could play a role in that. So what does all of this mean exactly? Well, essentially, we are seeing a perfect replay of the Trump 2016 dynamic. Centrist elites holding views that are overwhelmingly represented in the media and almost non-existent in the wild will resist Bernie. They will form well-funded think tanks and launch new media outlets to register their displeasure. They will construct overwrought op-eds published by our finest newspapers to try to explain to us poor, stupid Americans why our choices are so bad and so wrong. And they will wring their hands about the norms and guardrails, anything but the norms. And all the while, the whole of the Democratic base, whether they were feeling the burn from the start or not, will be perfectly happy to have him as the nominee and potentially the president, and a large portion of the base will actually be downright elated. Just look at the numbers here. Among all Democratic primary voters, Sanders consistently has the highest favorability. He is, in fact, the second choice of Biden voters and of Warren voters, demonstrating an ability to easily unite the party after the primary. And contrary to the industry talking points regularly parroted by debate moderators and industry-funded Washington elites, Medicare for All is very popular among Democrats, very popular. A new poll of South Carolina found overwhelming support for Medicare for All, especially among those aged 55 to 64 and among African Americans. 82% of both groups backed the plan. Apparently, Bernie Sanders isn't too radical for them. The base will easily solidify behind Sanders, who, remember, is the most trusted candidate on the top two issues of health care and climate. He actually more represents the Democratic base on economic issues than any other candidate, which is precisely why he is performing so well right now. In fact, I maintain that if it weren't for decades of brainwashing about exactly who is electable, he'd be running away with the nomination for exactly that reason. So the base will solidify, and meanwhile, the elites will rend their garments and clutch their pearls and weep openly about how they're left with no party. Last-minute plans will be hatched, ads will be aired, sternly worded editorials will be published, Bloomberg will be clutched to like a precious life raft. Never Bernie hashtags will trend, and meanwhile, the American people will move on with their lives with a little more hope that they might actually get some decent health care, and wondering once again what the hell is wrong with these people they see having daily televised meltdowns. I just see this dynamic so clearly unfolding where there is a lot of media angst.
Yes.
And the voters are like, what's the problem here?
Exact same thing.
No problem.
Exact same thing happened with Trump. What's the most important thing that you highlighted there is that Bernie is more with the base than every single other candidate. Same thing. Number one issue in 2016 election was immigration for Republican voters. Marco Rubio, Gang of Eight. Ted Cruz, they didn't trust him. The number one thing they looked at with Trump, they were like, this guy will actually do what he says he is going to do. That's the same thing with Bernie, because he has the same rhetorical and legislative record. Where
Right.
He's just been so consistent on trade, in particular on healthcare and all of this, that they can't help but they have no doubt in their mind whatsoever that even if he were to compromise,
Right.
is that he would fight as hard as he possibly could to get exactly what he wanted. And that's all they want. They
Right.
want somebody who's just going to do what they say they're going to do, because everybody has sold them out for so long. And it's amazing to me, because the truth is they want him to sell out. That's what the elites are panicking, the same way they panic with Trump, because the sellout is what they profit from.
They won't be able to control him.
That's what they arbitrage. Exactly. They can't control you. They can't control you via money and donors and all the other institutional pressures.
Your gig flow is going to be over.
When you reject that, it's the most powerful thing in American politics, and that is what America wants more than anything else in this country.
Right. Well, and I think also there's another dynamic here, which is that some of the Republican base that was nervous about Trump, they were nervous about him because they were afraid he would lose.
Yes.
And it's the same thing here. They weren't afraid of how he would govern. They were afraid that he would lose. And so once he didn't lose, they're like, okay,
That's
great,
exactly.
good
So
to go.
that's what happened
And so
at the Nevada caucuses. He won 50% of the vote, and that was it. He cleaned up every single one.
And so I think with Bernie, it's the same thing. That BuzzFeed article is actually very interesting to talk to these voters about how they feel about it. They're like, well, he's not my choice. But almost all of them, what they expressed was, we're worried he would lose. So if he wins the presidency, they don't have an issue beyond their fears of electability, which are like understandable given the rhetoric they've heard coming from the media for years and years and years. So they don't actually have an issue with, they don't find him scary in terms of being a president, which is what all these people, you know, Steve Ratners and the Joe Bidens and the Hillary Clintons, all these people, that's what concerns them, is how he would actually govern, because they know they wouldn't be able to control him. The other parallel that I see here is, you know, going into 2016, it wasn't clear that immigration was going to be the central issue for Republicans at all.
It actually wasn't at all.
He actually put it on the table. And it's the same thing with Democrats. There's no reason why healthcare would be the central, I don't think it was obvious to people coming in that healthcare would be the central issue, but it is such a sticking point in their lives, such an important part of their just like day-to-day struggle. And Bernie Sanders really elevated it and made himself and his plan the center of conversation.
It's genius, because again, the Trump parallel is phenomenal, because what would Joe Biden actually be running on if Bernie wasn't in the race, if he didn't exist? It would just be, take us back to 2012.
Yeah.
There would be no central policy platform.
Right.
The entire debate in the party is whether you agree with Bernie or whether you don't agree with Bernie, or agree with him on the margins but think that on execution we should do it differently.
Right.
That is the same thing with Trump.
Right.
He started out from the maximalist position, and that is what the base ultimately wants. They're not stupid. They know they're probably not going to get it, but they just want something as close to it as humanly possible. And when you start out with compromise, you're screwed.
They want
what
to
are
know.
you gonna do?
They want to know who's going to fight for it.
Exactly.
Who's really going to
Yeah.
fight for it. All right, Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That is next.